Hi, my name is Mason. Welcome to this video where we will discuss the transits and the configurations for the month of February, talking about the astrology ahead. Join my Patreon, becoming a subscriber if you like my content. Really helps me to create these videos and gives me that support to know that my audience likes what I'm doing. So appreciate that feedback. Always let me know. Like this video if you can. Comment your favorite aspect for this month. But let's get into it. So, yeah, this is an interesting month. We start out with this pile up in Capricorn right here, and we also have the Sun in Aquarius as well as Pluto in Aquarius. And as the month goes on, we will see that all of these planets will head into Aquarius and make their various configurations with Pluto, and then head into that square with Jupiter and make aspects with Uranus as well. And then we get into the Sun going into Pisces and Mercury following suit. And we'll wrap the month off with a configuration with the Sun, Saturn, and Mercury conjoined in Pisces. So yeah, we'll start out the month with Mercury going into Aquarius. Now, I actually really like Mercury in Aquarius. I think Mercury is really able to take advantage of the technologies, the tools, innovations, and a lot of the grassroots movements, which Mercury finds very relatable. Mercury is a planet that likes to see the fairness of both sides, likes to weigh the options, and Aquarius is really about that humanitarian effort to really see the collective from a clear individual understanding. Sometimes the individual can a lot of times paint and illustrate the collective's culture, as well as the intricacies of what it means to be opposite to the sign of Leo, the king. Aquarius represents a lot of those ideals, a lot of those more critical ideals of reality that we have to look at one by one and not just take as a whole. Aquarius is going to be a very important sign this year, especially with that Pluto entering into Aquarius that it did last month. So yeah, let's get into the 5th. So on the 5th, Mercury will enter into Aquarius and will also conjoin Pluto. And here, Mercury is going into the underworld. Pluto represents, Pluto is very, deals with the judgment, kind of the finality of things. When we've reached one thing, we've kind of had to shed a skin and start anew. Kind of like when you go down to the underworld and when you get judged, you're kind of weighing all these options. You're kind of seeing the truth for really what it is. And Mercury here is able to negotiate and understand a lot of these intricacies, reveal these hidden secrets, and also in another way, I like how Chris Brennan points out that configurations with Mercury and Pluto is kind of like you'll see people changing sides. And a lot of the times you see that because when Mercury reaches that finality, there's this kind of information, this like kind of information dump, this download, so to speak, that Mercury is getting. And so there's kind of like a decision. Do we keep going where we were, or do we figure out a new way? And Mercury is really able to do that. Mercury likes to figure himself out of circumstances, really likes to take things apart, put them back together. So Mercury and Pluto, there's a lot of illuminating and carrying that message of the underworld for the masses. What is this Pluto and Aquarius really getting down to in a nitty-gritty level? And a lot of this can be, heavy weights that we're kind of carrying around, that mercurial information that may be a little bit loaded sometimes, especially with that Pluto there, that takes a little bit time to digest, to process, and to really reflect. So with this configuration, I think one of those things, this is happening on February 5th, by the way, Pluto and Mercury conjoining each other, very, kind of unshackling a lot of these insights to be taken to the masses, kind of carrying this message that would free the masses, that would, like almost like nuclear codes being revealed, new revelations coming out, and the intricacies of power dynamics and how we deal with that, as well as also being able to create with new technologies, kind of getting into the wheelhouse of this kind of these new powers shifting, and how are they balancing with the people? How are the people kind of carrying some of these things and using them to their advantage? All right, so a couple days later, on February 7th, we will get Saturn right there and Jupiter right there. They will be very close. They will be at 7 degrees of Taurus, respectively, with Jupiter, and 7 degrees of Pisces with Saturn. And this is an interesting configuration because they won't actually meet up. That sextile will get the closest to where they can reach each other, but they're still not going to line up minute for minute. So it still won't be as a strong aspect as, it won't be, I don't think it'll be as strong, noticeable in terms of being able to point directly towards it and say, this is where we're going, so to speak. There's something like that, I think, with Jupiter and Saturn. They really do wish to kind of change, kind of be a little bit more nonconformist in how they wish to take on their goals and endeavors, especially with Saturn and Jupiter kind of reimagining the limitations and really retrying to create, giving the tools of creation and how are we going to use this to our advantage, which is sometimes a little bit controversial. A little bit like, well, you can't use the tools of God. You can't, unshackle yourselves from some of these things. This is just how it is. This is just the law. But a lot of that Saturn-Jupiter speaks to that long road of hope that we have to walk in order to get where we're going. And a lot of times, when we're going towards that destination, it takes a little bit of time. It takes a dedication. It takes resilience. We have to really mean it with our hearts. We have to be really interested in not just it for the self, but really in a broader sphere, in a really more idealistic way, what tethers our beliefs to our ideals, and how do we wish to create that and construct a reality that would benefit us. So this is kind of creating an opportunity for a more sensual grassroots movement, from breaking out of the mainstream and the spiritual movements and really or reorganizing them to be more supportive and efficacious, constructing and effecting the changes we wish to make. This is a lot of initial starts that we're getting into. Saturn and Jupiter had their conjunction at the beginning of Aquarius at the end of 2020, and where Pluto is right now. So we're not getting to the fruition of those plans. We're still kind of in this in between where we're creating things. We're maybe seeing some short-term fruits that are growing, but still they're not ripe enough to pick. Especially with this sextile, sextiles are not that strong. So this will be something to kind of help us get where we're going. Kind of say you're doing good. There's still a long work ahead, and with that, we'll also see this year as well with Jupiter getting into Gemini, where Saturn will impose a lot more restrictions on those plans. So right now we're kind of just budding with these ideas, kind of growing and trying to spring forth some of this hope, which we wish to really make real. And something with Jupiter I think is important to notice. Jupiter really helps to make things sustainable, help things last. If like you're in the gym and you're lifting, sometimes you think, oh, it's just Mars that's helping you gain muscle, but really it's Jupiter that's helping you have that lasting muscle. Mars can maybe get that muscle, but sometimes it's a little bit quick to go. So with Jupiter, we're really trying to make something stick. And sometimes, those controversial ideas that we have, which we wish to grow, the seeds we want to plant, how we wish to till the ground with those seeds, very Saturnian. That's going to take a little bit of time. It's going to take some dedication. So we're maybe able to see those fruits, but still not ripe enough to pick. All right, let's keep going. So that is on February 7th, and we got some other configurations that day. All right, so the same day we have Venus trining Uranus, and then the next day we will get the Sun trining Uranus. And it's important to kind of think about that, to frame those two together, because they're both applying to Uranus. And with this aspect, Venus is reaching into Taurus, getting into the gross and subtle differences between the concepts we wish to embody and wish to free ourselves to experience. There's a lot of these Taurian desires, these Taurian experiences, which Venus is trying to unshackle us, trying to get us to see the bigger picture of how that love and pleasure speaks to us on an individual level, as well as on a collective level. How are we engaging with the different rules and regulations that would allow us to engage with that? How are we taking the potential real steps to initiate our ability to take advantage towards this opportunity, allowing ourselves to be real, allowing our desires to be felt. Yeah, and I think with that aspect, we also see the sun squaring Uranus. So there's kind of like this idea of, especially with the sun being in detriment in Aquarius, kind of seeing yourself from maybe a little bit of an outside look from an outside point of view, and maybe acknowledging some of the flaws that we have, maybe acknowledging, okay, this is something that, I thought that this would be good. I thought that this would be helpful for me to build. This would be something that everyone would like. But there's this kind of side of that nature that the sun and Uranus is kind of trying to express, with as much as we have these flaws, as much as maybe we want to cover up these flaws, as much as we're maybe trying to fit into the collective, as much as we want to be liked by other people, there's a real need to kind of break away from that and to not do things in order to be seen or to be viewed in a certain way, but to really find that path of the soul, to really go towards that, the seat of the soul where the liver is, right? Especially speaking about Prometheus, how Prometheus has his liver plucked out every day by an eagle. There's this idea that it may not feel it may feel like we're exposing ourselves to some of those potential consequences, but at the same time, what's at risk? What's at risk is us seeing our flaws as just that, flaws, and not realizing that that radical ability to accept who we are is what empowers us. A lot of these flaws can sometimes be fitted around us in a way that can make us think that maybe that isn't that good. Maybe I shouldn't be doing that. But a lot of times, we need to kind of remind ourselves of the machine, the kind of the culture machine that forces us to act in certain ways. And so in this way, I think it can expose us to higher ways of establishing existence, being connected to information, thinking, rhetoric that highlights our abilities to surmount and to deal with those perceived flaws that we may find ourselves having. Being empowered and awoken in the heart of the Promethean myths, and having to answer potentially for our use or misuse of the Promethean innovation and fire, while still embodying the joyful and youthful nature to steal from the gods, and to have tools to craft the lives that we wish to live. So, yeah, this aspect on the 7th, I think, especially with Venus, the aspect will perfect on the 8th, but this is still an applying aspect. So to me, this is kind of speaking both towards that Venusian qualities that help us feel good, that help us establish that love and pleasure in our lives, but also the kind of reminder that we do have to face the music. We do have to kind of say, this is who I am. Maybe I don't necessarily, maybe society has kind of cultivated this image to be like this one thing, but you know what? I'm breaking out of that. I'm not assigning myself to that. I'm not living through that. So keep going on. We also get the next day is the lunation, the new moon in Aquarius. All right, so the new moon on February 9th. Let's get into it. So this aspect we have Venus. Venus is still kind of close to that trine with Uranus, as well as the sun and the moon being very close to that square with Uranus as well. And I think also it's important to highlight Pluto's positioning in Aquarius with Mercury. So with this, it's kind of like, where are we going? We've kind of made it into the underworld. We're dead center in the underworld with Pluto, right? And now we're kind of seeing this utopia, this kind of idea of, okay, we see the Promethean desires. We see where we want to go. With Jupiter and Uranus, I think a lot of this is kind of reestablishing our own sense of security, our own sense of sensuality, our own sense of comfort, our own sense of grounding in terms of how we can make money, in terms of how we can take advantage of life itself to grow and to expand our desires. So being smack dab in the middle of the underworld, we're kind of trying to ascend. We're trying to reach a destination. We're trying to climb our way out of hell. If we can make it out of hell, where are we going? Where is that story of the Promethean fire taking us? Symbolically. So, which path are we choosing? Are we running towards what is really sustaining us? Or are we running towards maybe what is keeping us tethered? Which do we find ourselves making bedmates with? This lunation in Aquarius, I think, also begs us to really acknowledge we are real. We're not just technology. We're not just, data points for a company. We matter. The individual very much matters. And we're human, and we need to remember that. We need to remember our own humanity in order to make it out of hell, right? Aligning our ideals within our intellect. Aligning the message of what that Pluto and Aquarius is really getting us to acknowledge. Resetting and realigning our path, especially with Saturn. This is in a Saturn-ruled sign, and the Sun will have another lunation. We'll have a full moon before we get that rebirth of the cycle, the synodic cycle with the Sun. But in a lot of ways, we're constructing that road towards the forbidden knowledge and tools. We're getting that Plutonian judgment and acknowledging, okay, this is as far as we go, but still there's a lot left to be imagined. There's a lot left that wishes us to enjoy, that wishes us to seek the pleasures regardless of that hellscape we are in. True and established knowledge of the past, bringing the knowledge and the codes, the trapdoors only Saturn knows in Aquarius, and unearthing and finding the secret instructions of humans from the gods, raising the price of listening to false prophets who do not commit to what they profess. And I think a lot of Saturn in Pisces is disillusioning a lot of these seemingly what is the moral authority that we are aligning ourselves with? How are we choosing that over maybe our humanity? How are we, are we kind of getting deeper into our practices? Are we really grounding ourselves with that? How are we using that spirituality and not just using it to micromanage people and to kind of create this kind of categories and labels of people? But, what are we doing? What are we using that Saturnian Pisces wisdom to dive deep into, especially with spirituality, especially with the collective, especially with imagination, and really kind of bridging what is the reality of life. How do we see it? And if it's just how we see it sometimes, maybe that kind of limits us to what the potentials are, especially if we're just using these labels to get by. Another thing to note with this lunation is that Mercury will square Jupiter the following day on February 10th. And with this, I think Mercury is connecting a lot of those Plutonian themes and sending them off to Jupiter to process them. With this lunation in Aquarius at 20 degrees Aquarius squaring Uranus and Mercury squaring Jupiter, there's a lot of budding out of maybe going towards where the pleasures are and redefining our humanity with those pleasures. Using those pleasures to really enact change, to enact meaningful change. Taurus is about the simple pleasures of life that sometimes we take for granted. I think a lot of times Jupiter. And I think this is asking us to not neglect the profound studies and application to take advantage of from the Promethean unleashing, unburdening of information, of power structures at play, of different dynamics that can kind of catalyze a lot of changes, that can catalyze a lot of innovation in areas that we didn't think were possible. So yeah, this lunation, this new moon in Aquarius will play a part with that. That lunation is kind of a rebirth, a renewal. So looking forward towards a new start, kind of reimagining our way to get out of that underworld, or at least seeing it for what it is. Pluto will be in Aquarius for quite a while, so there's no need to rush this. There's no need to expedite this process. A lot of this is kind of acknowledging where we are, seeing things from a real Promethean level, acknowledging, okay, this is kind of the structure that we're in. And if I want to do this, I may have to steal some fire from the gods, so to speak. Yeah. All right, so let's touch a little bit more on that Jupiter square with Mercury. So Mercury represents the intellect and Jupiter represents the god intellect. And a lot of those things, Mercury and Jupiter, on paper, they seem like they would go together. Jupiter represents wisdom, authorities that are experts on that wisdom, philosophers, really experts in that field that have accumulated a lot of experience and wisdom doing what they do so that they can become that teacher. And Mercury, in a lot of cases, is more so the student. There's maybe just kind of creating things that is, I found it. I looked up a YouTube video. I learned how to do it myself. That kind of a mercurial nature to just learn things, to just reinvent things, just pick a skill up and just be able to be good at it. So with that, sometimes Mercury and Jupiter, sometimes Mercury won't take as much advice from Jupiter. Sometimes Mercury will be a little bit cautious to maybe listen to an expert. Kind of like, well, I don't know if they just can do it because they're just so good at that. That there's kind of like this distance between those pairing. But with that, I think Mercury can really take advantage of the new insights, the innovations, and rely on Jupiter to assist him in that process of carrying that out, of balancing that information, seeing things from a bigger perspective. Mercury and Jupiter, when Mercury is able to kind of get in and look at the information, and sometimes, we'll look at the resources. Okay, maybe this isn't someone I exactly trust, so to speak. This isn't someone I would normally take advice from, but still allowing ourselves to use that information for our good. And in order to steal the fire from the gods, Mercury and Jupiter teaming up is pretty good. Being able to innovate, see things from a new perspective, being able to take that fire, figure out the tools, how you can work with it. Mercury and Aquarius, maybe getting some new technology to use and diffuse to the masses, to teach and to integrate that in our studies and in our data collection. All right, now let's move on. Let's keep going. And let's go to the 13th when Mars will enter into Aquarius. So I'll speak briefly on Mars in Aquarius first. Now, Mars entering in Aquarius, I think is important to look at, to be careful, to pay attention to. Mars in Aquarius, Mars is a lot of Mars' signification is kind of aligned with a more individual sense of kind of, this is where I come from, this is how I deal with this is my anger, these are my feelings. This is, individual. Mars is very individualized. And so in an air sign like the fixed air sign of Aquarius, ruled by Saturn, the other malefic, Mars is a little bit conflicts with the group at large. Is not sometimes, is a lot of times maybe the rebel that's pushing the envelope, that's acknowledging, okay, this is how everyone wants me, this is the ideal way that everyone wants me to be. Now that rubs against me in the wrong way. I don't align with that. Mars and Aquarius can sometimes relational problems with Mars can crop up with Mars and air signs. Just that kind of dynamic of, that chatter that Mercury or that Mars is not really used to. The kind of, what does everyone else think? What is everyone else doing about this? How is everyone else handling this? Mars in a lot of ways is not helped by that, not helped by that informational overload. Mars is kind of brute intellect. How do you use the tools at hand? How do you apply yourself? Yeah, Mars in Aquarius, I think, sometimes gets written as the villain, is sometimes, sees himself as the provocateur in those air signs, seeing himself from the outside looking in and not really wanting to connect with how others see him. Mars, in a community sense, Mars can be really fun in Aquarius, I think, also, kind of playing with those boundaries, kind of pushing the edge. Um, just kind of the abstract nature of Mars to kind of look at himself from the outside looking in and to maybe, use that to his advantage, kind of rewrite his villain story and kind of make it a little bit more evocative. Now, Mars in Aquarius, especially Mars in really any air sign, somewhat diffuses Mars' ability to be direct, be concisive. There's a lot of challenges with clashing with the group at large, even relationship challenges, difficulty giving up the self for the others. Because Aquarius is a very humble sign, and Mars is not, he doesn't like to be humble. He likes to be very direct and say, this is exactly what I did, because sometimes, Mars knows that if you don't say that, then you're not going to get the credit like that a lot of times. But in the other sense, when we're just kind of proclaiming this is all me, we're not recognizing some of the grassroots movement that allowed us to kind of rise up and to be able to do that, to affect change, to just meet with those individuals on a one-to-one basis rather than seeing things from a very, not grandiose, but just like maybe main character type of way. Difficult setting boundaries and being forthright, saying the right yeses, saying the right nos, but still being very decisive with sometimes where he wishes to go. Sometimes just, well, I said no and I'm going to say no. But with that, I think it's important to kind of look at that and to not use that information as a personification of us, to kind of recognize, okay, this is just information. Let's make of it what we will. So let's kind of get into a little bit more about Mars in Aquarius. So you know that as soon as Mars gets into Aquarius, Mars will conjoin Pluto, right? And this is a really interesting dynamic because Mars will also retrograde later this year and next year in the sign of Leo and Cancer and will oppose Pluto. So to me, this is like Mars getting a lay of the land, meeting the judgment of the gods, getting to the heart of the underworld and having that moment where he is where power is exercised upon him, where he's kind of given that judgment, that critique, where Mars is kind of being watched, where Mars is being judged, the actions and the way that Mars handles how he deals with other people, how he deals with the collective, how he interacts. There's going to be a very big emphasis on that. Kind of like, the judgment gods meeting Mars and Mars being very resilient, being very integrated into what he really wishes to do and not, being very tenacious to say, no, this is me. This is who I am. Sometimes a little bit too much to a point. Yeah, one thing I think about this configuration, especially with that retrograde kind of looming over us, is Mars is definitely getting written by as the villain here. There's a lot of power plays with Pluto and Mars, kind of the feeling of paranoia. Chris Brennan talks about Mars being watched over with this configuration, kind of like someone's looming over watching you, watching your actions. And with that finality, when Mars meets that judgment, when the war god meets the judgment god, the death god, to me, that interaction at play is kind of, there's some crimes, there's kind of some power play at hand, a little bit of power creep even, of kind of how you've been raising up maybe the kind of bar of what you're willing to do, what you're willing to risk in order to accomplish that goal, that war that you wish to siege. Was it worth it? Kind of laying that all out there and kind of acknowledging, okay, maybe if I do this too much, that's gonna be maybe seen as bad, but like at the same time, just because someone wants to judge or make it criticize that action that allowed that war to be won, maybe sometimes it takes away those tools just as much as it allows that power creep. There's kind of a unburdening and a building up. There's kind of Mars being somewhat taken down. And I think that this Mars-Pluto dynamic, there's kind of just that feeling of being watched, of not having all the control. So Mars is really feeling like, okay, I don't have all the control here. As much as I want to fight that war, it actually didn't get me where I wanted to go in the end. Yeah, and this aspect is a lot like kind of big tectonic plates shifting, big power plays shifting, being rough and tumble in the underworld, meeting the judgment god and the war god together, judgment of destruction against the people, the invisible of the invisible strings that are connected, which attach society and large structures at hand, being met with the light of Mars and exposing these plights. Outside looking in, he is not conducive to others here. Definitely, others are seeing him as needing that judgment, needing to but also with that judgment, it's kind of like we're being asked to be reappraised here, to really reappraise how we take on those martial actions. Overall, though, I think Mars is looking at, kind of the judgment, kind of being judged by being judged by society at large, so to speak. And in some way, he's planning his attack. He's planning his revenge. He's saying, okay, maybe I'm being written by the villain, but you don't understand this. You don't understand this. You don't understand that. And as much as you want to say it's just cut and dry, it's just this or that, it's really not. Sometimes I think when we're backed up against a wall, when we're really, when someone's really oppressed, when all of their control is taken away from them, they're going to do a lot of wild things to break out of that. They're going to do a lot of unpredictable things in order to escape that kind of decree. Now, with this aspect with Mars, with Pluto in Saturn's sign of Aquarius, Aquarius really levels out the playing field, making the powerful give up their ability to wield over the masses, restructuring by breaking down the established power and disintegrating it to give back to the masses, diffusing the ego, diffusing the powers that be, responsibility and discipline, rules and kings. How do these things not reflect the former and the latter? How do these things, how do the established kings kind of control that power? How do they use their own rules to construct and contain the people? So how do we reestablish a more level playing field for all parties, especially with that power creep at play, that kind of Mars-Pluto power creep that, we're kind of ratcheting things up? How do we deal with that? How do we surmount that problem? How do we surmount a problem that is just overwhelmingly vicious in some way? How do we make sense? How do we rectify the past to make sense of the future? How can momentary buildup of these notions cause waves to ripple? Yeah, one thing I think with this to bear in mind is definitely that opposition that will take place during the retrograde phase of Mars. So this is not the end of the story by no means. We're just getting into Pluto and Aquarius. So, we're just kind of seeing these things and how they're breaking down and how they will be also in turn reflected on and be brought up again next year when Mars is retrograding to the signs of Leo and Cancer. We'll really kind of get down to those power structures, how these things are interacting with each other. So let's keep going. All right, so amidst that conjunction with Mars and Pluto, we also get a sextile from Venus in Capricorn to Neptune in Pisces. So for the first time, Venus is all alone in the sign of Capricorn, able to go and connect to the nostalgia of the past, kind of thinking about, what was this place like? What was this place like before Pluto entered here? What was it like before Saturn and Pluto really rearranged the whole establishment? And reconnecting to old philosophies, reconnecting to how people worked before us, have Venus just connecting to the ancestors, the way that people have done things before us, and reimagining how we can get back to that in a grounded and sensual way to enjoy the love and pleasure of our lives, as well as to enjoy the work that we do, right? So we have this square with Mercury and Uranus right here, and at the same time the moon will be in Gemini. So I think this is a lot of fun, this aspect. A lot of trickster energy, a lot of pushing the envelope, pushing the boundaries of what we can create. And this is taking place roughly after that lunation. So we're capitalizing on a lot of these themes that we discovered during the new moon in Aquarius at 20 degrees of Aquarius. And especially with the moon in Gemini, transferring that light of Mercury to innovate, to communicate these expressions, to really break down what are these tools that we're being handed from Prometheus. Innovation in a lot of ways. Yeah, this is a pretty interesting dynamic, pretty loud itself, wishing to expound the boundaries and the rules, really wishing to get into that Taurian felt sense of, okay, what is the artistry that we can create with this? Uranus and Mercury are looking at all of the experiments that they can create, pushing the envelope with new technologies, innovating, creating, and to highlight some of those themes that we're pushing towards with Pluto in Aquarius as well as Mars in Aquarius right now. Some of this may be a little bit edgy, some of this may be a little bit, punch in the throat of the powers that be, to reestablish a sense of, what is this dynamic integration of how we can create and use the tools of Pluto and Aquarius to reinvent a lot of the culture, to reestablish some ideals that we wish to see taking place in our day-to-day lives in a more sensual and felt out way. All right, so continuing on, we have Venus enter Aquarius on the 16th as well. And Venus likes to cooperate with others in the sign of Aquarius. Venus actually does really well in Aquarius, I think. Venus likes to be in service to others. Venus likes to understand relationships and others' values, ideas, especially as it reflects the collective, being more in touch with a broader stream of cultures, in terms of having to engage with others and present ourselves. Kind of how can we be a team player? How can we understand the values that we have, that each other holds? Venus likes to be very eclectic in the sign of Aquarius, not really wishing to see beauty just as not just seeing beauty as kind of this perfected object or this perfected mold that's been established, but being a little bit subversive with that beauty and kind of seeing maybe the beauty in things that ordinary people would say is a little bit ugly, that would maybe think, oh, that doesn't really go well together. Venus is a little bit more eclectic here, a little bit more of a wallflower. Definitely like Venus in Aquarius. Love that. We love that. I have that. But yeah, socially aware, willing to empathize and understand others, social compassion, authenticity, being aware and caring about how others view things and their own experiences, diversified sense of understanding each other, breaking down the I and seeing the team in that. Venus detaches from those more bodily engagements in the sign of Aquarius. It is maybe a little bit not as intimate with those desires for self, but is maybe more integrated in how the collective may view that. So with this, I think it's important to be discriminate of who we enjoy, what we enjoy with who, especially with Pluto and Mars. Kind of just, as much as we want to express ourselves and, be honest about our own desires, sometimes we can kind of make a little bit work of that by not acknowledging that maybe not everyone is going to see us from that inside perspective. You're going to maybe see us from a little bit more of from a more distant, detached perspective that maybe doesn't paint all of the story. There's something about Venus being here that I think is definitely willing to be in service to others, but in that capacity, I think Venus in Aquarius wishes to acknowledge that, I want to be in service to these people because I really like these people. I really like how they make me feel. I like, I like interacting with them because new ideas bud. I'm able to think in a different way, and sometimes when when planets go through Aquarius, there's some kind of how do we deal with how others see us that are maybe on the opposite side of the spectrum. How are we acknowledging maybe our differences, but also acknowledging what makes us the same, And in a lot of ways, I think Venus in Aquarius, that detachment from the more sensual feelings, the more internal kind of pleasures that Venus wishes to express is sometimes not as Venus. I think there's a little bit of a struggle there, especially with Aquarius being a malefic sign. There's a little bit of a feeling bound in some way to society to not express as much as we wish to, and feeling a little bit held back in those expressions. But yeah, we'll get more into Mars and Venus's configuration because I think that'll be a little bit. Venus will be a little bit more willing to kind of dig into her own pleasures and expose those. But yeah, that's kind of Venus in Aquarius. All right, so as much as we want all those good things with Venus in Aquarius, Venus also has her configuration, her conjunction with the planet Pluto. And this does happen the same day. Actually, it happens on the 17th. So let's go to that. So on the 17th, we will have Venus and Pluto conjoin in the sign of Aquarius at 0 degrees, right? And this is important to, I think, the myth of Persephone is really important to highlight here. That kind of feeling like you're being taken into the underworld. Because as soon as Venus enters in the sign of Aquarius, she's willing to understand the collective, understand other people's expressions. And in so doing, there's kind of like this taken feeling where she goes into the underworld with Pluto, that kind of Persephone myth. And as much as we wish to express these things, it's almost like they kind of burned a hole in our heart. They burned that image of how we, that kind of judgment image of maybe that expression being experienced in maybe a bad way or in a way that takes us into the underworld, and we have to kind of figure our way out of we have to figure ourselves out. We have to figure our way out of that underworld. So with this, especially with that Mars being very close by, there's some power plays. Venus and Mars and Mercury and the Sun have all went through Pluto's new territory in Aquarius. They've all conjoined Pluto and Aquarius. So there's definitely this subversion of the ego and questioning everyone's right to exist in this new world. We can rewrite the story of our own life and move the weight of societal expectations off of us and explore and domesticate a new area, but the choice is how we will act different when outside forces push us to do the same things which we have done. There's kind of like this, reality where Venus enters Aquarius, and as much as, we wish to interact with society, we wish to have fun and play games, and to see each other, see people from across the aisle and connect with them, there is this kind of idea that we're having to face a little bit more of a rigorous meeting in terms of being able to do that. There's a little bit more of a serious nature to that meeting. And so I think in a lot of ways, as much as we want to write that story out, we have to kind of constrain ourselves to work with the story that we're being handed and to finish the ending, to kind of carry that on. There's some of the story that's already been written, but there's some part of it that wishes to interact with the future. And so now we're kind of getting into that Aquarius-Pluto underworld where we're maybe seeing this hellscape, seeing it for what it is. Kind of that Venus, I think, is definitely grounding us, definitely giving us a little bit more of levity to really engage with that new world in a more felt out and sensual way, that it would actually help us to get a little bit more insight into what's going on, especially the social struggles that we would see, how people, how we wish to engage with that love. Because, Venus does represent love. Yeah, and so with this aspect, with this configuration of Venus moving into Aquarius and conjoining Pluto on the 16th and then the 17th with Pluto, respectively, there's definitely a way that we need to kind of see the new world. It's a brave new world, and we have to kind of figure out how we stand with each other. Where are our values in relation to the larger societal problems at hand that affect all of us on an individual level? What are the rules of consensus? How do we have consensus now, and how do we reach that, especially after Venus is taken into the underworld and has really seen some of those underworld themes that Aquarius is going to take on now? All right, so on February 18th, the sun ingresses into the sign of Pisces. Now, I really like the sun in Pisces. We love the sun in Pisces. I'm a sun in Pisces native myself. So with the sun in Pisces, as much as the sun wants to be very jovial, wants to gel with everyone, wants to, get in that soup of Pisces, kind of share emotions, be empathetic, understand people from this very soul level of, we got this. We're tied to our morals. We're tied to what makes us human. We're tied to the good things of the soul. Sometimes with the sun in Pisces, I think it's a little bit difficult to assert oneself. The sun in Pisces does really well to share stories, to share moral points of views, to really align ourselves with our emotions, to really see things from a point of the soul's level. What is the direction in which we wish to take? Where are we going with that? And as much as we'd like to hand out bits of our soul to other people, to express ourselves very modestly, to express ourselves with love, and to share that inner parts, the inner workings of our soul with others, there's still this need for the sun to not be as flexible as maybe he wishes to be in Pisces. As much as we're engaged with those emotions, sometimes the sun in Pisces, there's a little bit of a flexibility that will leave us spread thin. We may be sharing something to one person and then realizing that as much as we share that other person may not have the same moral views as us, which can really undermine the feelings which we layer the soul on, right? So the sun wants to kind of have that gelling, have that soup, engage with others in that jovial sense, but we also have Saturn there, right? And so there's something to be cautious about. So yeah, the sun in Pisces is going to want to figure those internal workings of the soul, connect with others. And as much as we want to do that, Saturn is right there, kind of expressing our limits, expressing that there is this kind of deep boundary that we need to acknowledge. As much as we wish to kind of collect all of these people in one category, we need to be a little bit more discriminative of how we give out that solar light, of how we're extending those pieces of our soul to others, and not just giving that piece of our soul to others as a means to look good. And I think the sun in Pisces does very well, but as much as we want to have that jovial kind of happiness with us, we still have to be human. We still have to be who we are. We still have to recognize that as much as, it's good to be in service to others, and it's good to share the journeys of our soul with others, there is this real difficulty when we're trying to express something to someone that just does not feel the same to us. Maybe an enemy that is not wanting to learn from us, or even us not wanting to learn from an enemy and see things from their point of view. The sun and Saturn definitely have an enmity together. Definitely don't like being next to each other. So as much as we want to kind of have everyone agree with where we're going and say, look, I'm doing all of these good things, I'm doing all of these good deeds. Can't you see that my worth is in all of my actions? Can't you see that my work is in all my good deeds? There's this reality that you can't spread yourself so thin that that you expect other people to understand your soul, to be able to see that part of you, to really see what you're trying to do, to see the workings of what those Pisces waters wishes to heal, wishes to transmute, and wishes to deeply understand. We have to kind of acknowledge that and be aware of our emotions, pensive thoughts, and where our sensuous desires take us. They can take us to really great places, and they will, but we need a little bit of a slower approach to that. We need to be a little bit more diligent in mapping that soul rather than just expressing it on the get-go. There's a little bit of patience that we need to refine that. And as much as, we want to be out there expressing our deep love, our admiration towards other people, we definitely need to take into consideration that the work that we are doing to spread that love and pleasure, sometimes that's really good for us, but it may be just good enough that we do it. And it doesn't have to depend on someone else's interaction to make it good enough. Being able to have that boundary with yourself to say, okay, this is where my moral obligations fall. I'm not relying on someone else to be the moral authority here. I'm really counting on myself to be integrated in that. Just because someone is critical about this or whatever that I'm doing does not take away from what I am actually doing and contributing. That Sun-Saturn pairing, especially with Saturn being in Pisces, I think it's important to acknowledge that this configuration is really trying to get us to acknowledge you can't just listen to some moral authority, to some religious philosophy, to whoever to really decide your fate and what you're going to do with that. You have to use your own light to your own advantage. You have to see your light for what it is, acknowledge what you've been given, and use that regardless. Not engage with it just because it's going to be good for you, but do it because you're trying to grow. Doing it for a reason that kind of connects us to our beliefs. That's something that definitely Pisces is trying to say. Pisces loves to kind of get us back into that. Well, and what was the reason? Why are we really here? Where are we really going? What is the point of this in a lot of ways? Especially with that Saturn being there and that Neptune, there's a disillusionment of a lot of these moral systems at play. So in the end, it's kind of like if you're not able to match that up with how you think and kind of rely on your own moral views to decide where you're going in life, it's going to take a little bit longer for you to get there because you're only going to get little bits and pieces from people that you may think are trying to, give you your soul back. As much as we may give, this is a theme that I think of in Pisces is definitely like, Pisces likes to collect. Pisces likes to add things to the soup. It likes to taste things. It likes to see things from a moral sense of justice, of how we can shape our lives and be encoded in these deep, this foundational spiritual reality in a way that educates us on a philosophical level as well as a day-to-day level in our lives. Yeah, so this configuration with the Sun and Saturn and Pisces, I think the Sun and Saturn also speak to paternal figures in our life. Where that strength comes from, that lineage, where we draw that source from. And in a lot of ways, the Sun and Saturn, they have enmity. One does not want to be like the other, and the other does not want to be like the other as well. So, we're trying to balance how do we rectify these moral points of view in a way that allows us to be seen, to be understood, and also on a real level that doesn't separate us from the past, that doesn't completely sever us from all of those that came before us, but really reestablishes that lineage in a new direction, in a way that we can take it even further. So, yeah, one of the major theme, I think, for this Saturn-Sun aspect, though, is definitely not relying on another moral authority to align ourselves with what we should be doing, with what we think is right, what we think is just, but really acknowledging that is on us. That burden only can be dealt with, that can only be done with our own consideration, with our lives, with our history, as well as, just what's going around in the world. And always trying to reflect on other people and their own moral views, can sometimes leave us lost in how we wish to actually take life on and direct life. Sun really struggles to be firm in the sign of Pisces, and with Saturn, there's kind of no choice. You have to draw those boundaries. You have to be clear about these things. You can't just use your image as some sort of like, well, this is what's good, so they're going to see that I'm good because I'm doing what's good. You have to be a little bit wise. You have to be a little bit smarter than that. You have to take in consideration that just because the actions, to you seem good, how are we using that goodness to maybe take us in a wrong direction? Just because we think we're aligned with something good, maybe that goodness doesn't necessarily come from, that's not, as much as we may take these things in a new direction, we have to be really integrated with our own sense of morality, what we think is right, what we think is just. All right, let's keep going. So now we're getting into, let's go to the 21st when Venus and Mars will meet up at 6 degrees of Aquarius. So this is an interesting aspect. I actually really like Mars and Venus, their configuration on the 21st, their conjunction. I think that Mars and Venus can somewhat balance each other. Mars is maybe wanting to push the envelope, and Venus is maybe wanting to not do that and just try and actually see what the consensus is and align with that rather than trying to create something new or do something new, take that decisive action in a new direction. So yeah, with this configuration, Mars and Venus, there are a lot of love and pleasure, those two. The act of compassion by surrendering to your own innermost desires to sow seeds and grow your own cultivated atmosphere. Mars can protect the atmosphere while Venus tends to it. This is planting the seeds in the minds of the audience, planting those seeds of how we wish to express ourselves, how we wish to evoke that sense of creation. Mars and Venus are a lot of willpower. How do we direct that willpower? Because a lot of times it's directed with our desires. Those two go together very well. How do we fit this into the larger social structures at hand and try to raise the potential reality of the wonderful beginnings that can coincide with that can coincide with our desires? How are we willing to plant that? Now, as much as those things sound great, Mars and Venus can also be a little bit difficult as well. Sometimes potentially too good to be true, but a lot of power and a lot of attraction, a lot of gravitas to this, especially with that Pluto there, as well as Venus and Mars coming up on their square to Jupiter. So this is trying to realign, especially with Jupiter, trying to realign our sense of moral aptitude, what we think is right in the community, what we think is just in the world, and how do we wish to correct that? How do we wish to realign with that? Unifying others to appeal to the more humble and looked over parts of society, integrating ourselves with a little bit of that humanity, of that reality of what it means to be a human today in 2024 and not in past times. Aquarius is the fixed air sign of Saturn, humble, meek, ego-dispersing, idealistic, detached, being involved with groups and working towards higher unified and collective movements. This is definitely a cool, horny aspect with with Mars and Venus there. Kind of a little sexual. I swear, how many times have I we love it. How many times have I talked about sensuous love, pleasure in this one fucking video? But yeah, this is a little bit of a debaucherous aspect, a little bit of a cool, horny, detached, nudist, beta bro aspect. Really being honest with how we naturally feel and what our humanity directs us towards. Being a little bit more eclectic, not being concerned so much with the aesthetics, as much as we are more concerned with evoking change, evoking the inner desires and how we wish to expound on those. Yeah, this is a aspect especially configured with Jupiter, but yeah, overall that Mars and Venus, there's definitely a debaucherous sense, and a lot of times Venus is a little bit struggles in these aspects with Mars to kind of understand and to connect with that martial sense of where Mars is actually going with this. Sometimes it can seem like Mars is kind of doing one thing, but in reality he may be knocking up against a boundary in order to kind of show well, I can't do that, I can't do that, so can you kind of direct me a little bit. There's this Mars wants to do things well. Mars is really decisive. He wants to direct himself. But with Venus there, I think Mars and Venus, they can, they help each other out. Mars is benefited by Venus's sensual pleasures and kind of the realities that Venus understands, the different kind of felt experiences that Venus can tap into, where Mars is a little bit numb to that. Mars is a little bit kind of unaware in that direction. So Venus kind of balances that out and helps Mars to be a little bit more, kind of push the boundaries in a way where he's expressing himself a little bit better. It's definitely a harder aspect for Venus. Venus is struggles a little bit, I think, with this aspect, especially with that conjunction with Pluto, just getting out of the underworld, still really in the underworld of Pluto. Pluto now being Aquarius, so still kind of putting the pieces together. And in some way, Mars and Venus definitely demonstrate this kind of consensus of, okay, what is the right? What's the bad? Okay, this is really good. And, I actually like this, but some people don't like that. So how do I make sense of this? How is there consensus with how the direction I wish to create, with what I wish to go about society? How do I relate to society in a way that I can cohesively interact and not just be the outsider? How do I fit in this way where maybe sometimes I have to give up this one thing in order to conform in this other way? And in a lot of ways, this is kind of like this is a little bit of I would say a little bit more nonconformist, a little bit willing to get into that nitty gritty of the underworld, not being too concerned with the aesthetics of how other people are seeing these two planets, but just kind of being a little bit more honest, being a little bit more, this is kind of what is, Mars kind of stirring Venus up to be more honest about those desires. But, in that, Venus does risk a little bit more than Mars. There's a little bit of, Venus kind of really surrendering. Yeah, Venus here is somewhat constrained by Mars and is in some way reacting to that, and is trying to work against Mars and trying to constrain Mars to be a little bit more softer, to be a little bit more peaceful. With this aspect right here at 6 degrees of Aquarius, really interesting to note, but Mars later this year on December 5th will station retrograde at 6 degrees of Leo. So really interesting to look at that and how this aspect will be a little bit more, will be something to definitely watch, something to consider. What kind of arises from this will be looked at again when Mars starts his retrograde phase next year in December, this year in December 2024. So yeah, and I think that Venus is in the position to constrain Mars to kind of say, no, Pluto, this is the bad guy, and we need to get him out of here. And again, I think Mars is surveying the terrain, especially with his aspect to Jupiter. Yeah, that aspect to Jupiter is, a lot of it is working against Mars's, it's kind of constraining Mars, kind of acknowledging, okay, Mars is in some way the bad guy here, and we need to deal with that. We need to kind of work with the justice and the laws to make sure that this is taken care of, that this is handled. Now, Mercury in Pisces is a little bit tricky because Mercury can do very well in Pisces. Pisces is a sign of education. It's a sign of deep wisdom, of learning, of philosophies, especially religious philosophies, moral systems. But more or less, it's a sign of deep wisdom, right? And so there's a lot of significations that Mercury actually really aligns well with in Pisces. The problem is that Mercury may be able to understand all these really deep, intricate details, but the problem is sticking the landing, trying to communicate that. Kind of trying to connect all of these things from point A to point B. It's a little bit difficult. In that soup, it's like everything is interconnected. So as much as we get really far with one thing, the extent to how we can express that is a little bit stunted because there's so much to go through. There's a very deep-rooted integration with wisdom here that is somewhat over Mercury's head. Now, Mercury does very well with understanding wisdom, education, and all that, and is really able to get creative here. The assertiveness of Mercury, though, is somewhat compromised because Mercury, as much as he can really be educated, really very smart in this sign, there is this struggle picking one thing and sticking to it. Mercury in Pisces is really adept at understanding others, seeing other people's points of views, learning through experience, but struggles to articulate his own expressions, is able to kind of connect to other people's interactions, able to see how other people are seeing things, but is more or less struggling to articulate that wisdom as he sees it himself. There's a little bit of this difficulty trying to assert that wisdom, trying to assert that established expert opinion. There's a little bit of, well, yeah, this person said this, but actually goes a little bit deeper than that. So technically, I don't really know if I have all the pieces to the puzzle yet. And so with that, Mercury kind of struggles to stick to one thing. There's kind of like, oh, well, there's this there, there's this there. Yeah, Mercury really struggles to act and connect the various data points and where they actually go. So this is going to be a difficult transit, I think, especially for Mercury. Really having to ponder and to really penetrate those deeper qualities in a way where Saturn's kind of setting the boundaries and saying, this is how far we go and we need to keep going. We need to be very rigorous with our intellectual efforts. So sometimes that can also create maybe a self-critical nature, which in the sign of Pisces I think is a little bit not good for Mercury, especially because Mercury is already like a little bit there struggling to communicate and articulate himself. There's a little bit of this, as far as I get, you know, I need to kind of, my sort of fun, my sort of intellect is a little bit is not contributing to articulating myself very well in this sign. I'm a little bit struggling to get to point A to point B because, you know, I may think that this makes sense, but on another level, that kind of Piscean level of moralities and the different intricacies of the God intellect, I'm not really sure how these other people think about that. So maybe it makes sense to me, but expressing how it does make sense to others is where I kind of fail to stick the landing. Yeah, this aspect is definitely about not being clean or drawing within the lines, but Neptune is really blurring reality and making things fuzzy. A lot of buzzing around of kind of, you know, what does this mean? What is the deeper intricacies of this spiritual idea, this rhetoric that I'm being exposed to? How can I understand it and digest it so that it makes sense, so that I can use it for my own good? Yeah, this is an interesting configuration. We'll get more into Saturn, Sun, and Mercury, that cazimi that will happen at 9 degrees of Pisces. All right, so let's keep going. On the 24th is when we have the full moon in Virgo, and we also have Venus squaring Jupiter. So let's talk about Venus squaring Jupiter. In this case, Venus has the overcoming square to Jupiter. Jupiter is in her sign of Taurus, and so Venus is fitting out Mars in a nice uniform to take Venus out on a nice date. The sensual and good pleasures of life outweighing the overly good, the moral, and the righteous way to behave, Venus throws Jupiter's rules out the window and has him accommodate to her standards of joy, pleasure, and forwardness that Jupiter may be somewhat shy to. Yet Venus and Jupiter definitely speak to love affairs, and that Mars is right there, so there's definitely kind of this sense of intimacy and inclusion, trust and pleasure. How do we interact with each other? How do we have trust with each other? How do we, how do we have that trust so that Venus isn't feeling like she's risking it all? How are we engaging with this atmosphere? How are we acknowledging a lot of these laws and the consensus of society in order to accommodate ourselves in lieu of the more personal pleasures? Trying to collaborate, but doing so a little bit more awkwardly, almost like Venus wants to have the personal pleasures, but is also kind of maybe still dealing with some of the underworld qualities, and so is letting Jupiter just enjoy himself and kind of wanting to douse Jupiter with a lot of love. And yeah, so this is a lot of this is I think Jupiter and Venus, they kind of deal with that intimacy. How do we have trust with each other? How do we gain that trust and express the love that we wish to share? Jupiter speaks to the laws, the regulations, the way people should behave, this kind of upstanding way of citizens. So how do we honor our sensuality, and how do we let go of expectations of others filling our own needs and take care of them ourselves? How are we kind of going about our expectations in a way that allows us to be fulfilled? Yeah, this aspect, there's a lot of gravitas, there's a lot of how are we defining the way that we come together to enjoy the love and pleasure that we wish to create? How are we enjoying our humanity? How are we acknowledging the limits of our own humanity and recognizing, okay, these are some things that are kind of moral. This is kind of some moral intricacies that we may not really see on a felt level. We may just see it from a little bit more of a visual level, and here we're kind of getting into how does this look when we interact with each other? How do we engage with this in a more honest way, where we are saying, okay, this is my limitation, I can only go this far with you, but we also need to acknowledge that sometimes we can get in our own way. Sometimes that awkwardness can kind of deflate the ability to be human, to be sensual with ourselves. This is there's a need to kind of let go and to accept the pleasures that we have, but at the same time to acknowledge, the differences that we have with each other, and to not just put like with like. How can we enjoy our pleasures without being contrary to each other, or the reverse? Pleasuring others and forgetting to participate oneself, detaching from the awkwardness and just bum rushing each other. All right, yeah, so the main theme for this is definitely trust and pleasure seeking. How do we go about intimacy and inclusion, and figure out a way that we can trust each other when we are seeking those things, when we're seeking the love and pleasure from each other? How can we how can we rely on our moral systems to better engage with each other? How are we integrating ourselves in the collective with some morality that allows us to be educated about where others come from, their own cultural experiences, and to not just to really respect each other in that way, and to acknowledge each other's humanity as well as each other's desires amongst that. All right, so let's get into the full moon in Virgo on February 24th. So this is a Saturn, Sun, Mercury alignment. With this configuration, Jupiter being right there in Taurus, ruling Mercury, the Sun, and Saturn, as well as Mercury ruling this lunation in Virgo. This is capping off the end of that Saturn cycle. We're completing that synodic cycle with the Sun and Saturn, and with that, we're kind of restarting anew. But in order to do that, we're kind of seeing the last gasp of what we have created. Kind of, okay, these are some things that maybe went wrong. The best laid plans of mice and men. Something about our plans isn't always going to be successful. And it's important to acknowledge that. It's important to say, okay, this is where maybe we got it a little bit wrong. And with both of these planets being combust under the Sun, we're just kind of internally readjusting where we're wishing to go. And as much as we must work towards a successful outcome, we still must balance ourselves with work and play. we're going to get some things wrong, but we still need to kind of, okay, I did this, but I still need to enjoy myself. I still need to take time to release a lot of the stress. Wherever we're planning on going, there's a long road to get there, and we're gonna have some fallouts. We're gonna have some mistakes that happen. Mercury in Pisces, right there, ruling that lunation, is suggesting that there's a little bit more than meets the eye here. There's a little bit more to these mistakes than just being simple mistakes. And understanding that and how we can connect to that can allow us to bridge the gap to where we want to go. And kind of acknowledge, okay, these are my skills. And you know what? This is kind of over my shoulders. This is over my head, so to speak. This is over my head. Some of these things, I'm going to get there, but I have to take time. I have to be diligent. I have to say, these are my boundaries. This is, especially with Saturn right there, the boundaries. This is maybe the vision that I wish to create. The sun, the full moon, especially with that lunation, the moon in Virgo. These are the things which I wish to array. A lot of the times I'll think about the sun or just Pisces being like the fish, kind of like the dream of what we wish to create. And okay, this is where my desires come from. This is where the deepness of my imagination comes from, which also illuminates the work that I do to really take care of that. To take the fish, gut the fish, clean it out, prepare it, season the fish, lay it on the grill, cook some other things. That process of doing that with our dreams, of doing that with our lives, can a lot of times, we may find the first time we do that, oh my gosh, this is a lot more intricate than I really realized. This is a lot more detailed. This is a lot deeper than I really thought it would go. And we still need to try that, though. We still need to risk. We need to have a little bit of enjoyment by doing that. Sometimes we're wanting to connect to these really big structures in life. We're wanting to take on these grander spiritual movements, these grander tapestries of the imagination. But there's a lot of studying that we have to get done. There's a lot of wisdom that takes place in order to get to where we want to go. And as much as we may want to get there really fast, we have to understand that there's a certain arraignment of time that would allow us to get there. And the more diligent we are to acknowledging the mistakes that we are making, it'll help us to get to where we are going. There's no mistakes, just lessons. There's no mistakes, just lessons. Lessons on the way that teach us, that educate us. And so as much as we can get to that point where we're saying, no, this is a part of my education. This is a part of my learning process. This is a part of growing. This is a part of reaching beyond myself. This is the deeper, the deeper we get into these internal indicators to tell the story, we realize this is far bigger than us than we really imagined. And we need to take into consideration the long-term outcomes and implications of our seemingly small steps along the journey. Sometimes we'll think, well, this is really not that big of a deal. But in reality, the further that we progress, the further that we get towards that, the more we'll realize all of these skills, these talents that we have really contribute to that bigger picture, that grander tapestry. How can we let go of one thing to pick it up again later so that we can maybe sometimes, have a little bit of a perspective to see, this is maybe what I was missing. This is maybe something that I wasn't considering. This is something maybe I can use to my knowledge so that I can get educated and further my progress. And sometimes we realize, maybe I need to pick this up at a later time. I'll do this later. Right now, I gotta take care of this. I gotta take care of that. I'll come back to it. That Saturn wishes us to hang on, like a farmer planting seeds. We have to wait. We have to be patient. And the more that we are patient, the longer that we'll hang on to it, the longer that we'll see that return, the longer that we'll see that return on investment. So this is an interesting lunation. Definitely not one that'll. This is a trickier lunation. We'll get in. This is kind of leading up to that cazimi with Mercury and Saturn. So let's keep going. All right, so on February 27th is when we have the square, from Mars to Jupiter. So this is one that I think is really interesting. Mars is very hedonistic, and Jupiter does like to be hedonistic, but when Mars and Jupiter are together, I think Jupiter is more worried about correcting and aligning Mars with more upright laws and behaviors. Mars is, the zeal and the disgust of how Mars handles himself from Jupiter's perspective is there's somewhat of this kind of constraining Mars to really acknowledge some of those realities, some of those laws that maybe he struggles to abide by. And in some case, there's this misunderstood expectations, especially from Mars to Jupiter, and also really powerful expectations. With this aspect, there's a lot of toil that comes from trying to prove oneself in the public eye, sharpening mental impulses, making some judgment errors, and toiling for a desired outcome, misunderstood expectations as well as powerful expectations, salacious understanding from others that misunderstand the strength of Mars, accusations and people suspicious and disapproving, and advancing towards escalation to control those they perceive to be entangled in more repugnant acts. So definitely another kind of case of writing Mars as the villain here. I think that Mars and Jupiter can go well for certain things, like our will, kind of directing our will where we wish to go. As much as we wish to direct our will in line with our morals, we have to be honest about society at large and how other people may see those morals, may see those behaviors to be something else. So with this, again, Mars is trying to evoke this sense of fulfillment, this sense of using our beliefs to fulfill our needs. And in some way, we have to be cautious about not overexerting that to the point where people are trying to get us to behave more commonly, more plainly, in a way that is fitting for society with the standards and laws of living like an upright citizen. Alright, so let's get into this Mercury, Sun, Saturn, cazimi in the sign of Pisces at 9 degrees. So with this aspect, Saturn will be above Mercury on the ecliptic, and the Sun will be higher than these two planets on the ecliptic. And of course, the Sun outlines the ecliptic and is a path. So with this, though, this is a really interesting aspect. Now, Mercury, during his cazimi moments, usually has this opportunity to have this one-on-one aspect with the Sun. To kind of say, okay, now's my time, I get to be renewed, I get to be reborn, I get a fresh start, I get some insight from the heavens, I get some messages from the heavens, and I'm cleansed and I'm purified in order to make my way forward and to keep going. But in this case, Saturn's right there. So Saturn's like kind of interrupting this meeting by saying, we got some bigger business to handle, and you're going to have to help me carry this load. And I was looking at different times in history. I was looking at one particularly. The last cazimi with the Sun, Saturn, and Mercury happened actually in the sign of Scorpio on, I believe, October 31st of 1983. And some really interesting things coincided with that date. Some things happened after that. Actually, really close to this date was the release of the music video Thriller by Michael Jackson. And some things that happened following this, because when this aspect perfects, we do not see these two planets for quite some time. So it's important to note that a lot of the fruits of this aspect, we'll start to see when the Sun leaves them by conjunction, and when we can start seeing them again visible in the sky, right? So with this configuration, last time this happened on after October 31st in 1983, in November, the Turkish part of Cyprus declares independence. Zapatista Army of National Liberation is founded in Mexico, as well as Ronald Reagan going to South Korea to strengthen the allyship with the Pacific Power. Now, one thing also to note is that in Taurus, Jupiter is sextile in this aspect, Jupiter's at about 10 degrees Taurus. So there's definitely like this kind of, we really have kind of made it to this point where there's a lot of things we have to change. We have to kind of get out of this place that we're in. We have to kind of realign ourselves with some allies that can help us to our advantage. So touching back on this theme of Mercury with Saturn and the Sun in the sign of Pisces, and kind of reflecting back on the last time when these planets configured together similarly in the sign of Scorpio, there's a lot of war going on. Some different schisms with people. And with that, there's kind of this idea that we have to make our way out of that. We have to find our way to a point where we can have established freedom for ourselves. And how can we break out of these bonds of Saturn? How do we break out of these shackles and get out of this? Especially with Mercury. I think Mercury especially wants to wiggle his way out of it. He wants to, okay, we can do it. We can find our way out of this. I got this. We can think our way out of this. We can deal with it. We can maybe connect to other people, talk to other people, interact with different parties to establish some sort of alliance, especially with that Jupiter aspect right there. There is some support that we can have. Now, with this, it's important to consider the information that's being brought to us, the tendencies we find ourselves in when we have this information brought to us, and to be careful to not let whatever comes out of this to really make its appearance on dry land yet. To be a little bit more cautious with where the direction we wish to go with this, and to really work this out. Now, Mercury here, I think, is somewhat struggling to be acknowledged here, to be, yeah, there's something about this aspect that I think Mercury is really kind of towing a lot of the weight. And especially with this configuration, Mercury is at the bottom. So Mercury is carrying a lot of weight for these people, carrying a lot of weight for these two planets. It's kind of like, notice me, I did this for you and nothing. You know, Mercury's kind of wanting to shine in some way, but is needing to be subordinate and concealing secrets. This is a really important time, I think, where it's like concealing secrets, kind of carrying that weight of information with you and not being disturbed by the Neptunian waters to be disillusioned by that. Not engaging in public activities, concerned about all matters turning out, and being very careful. There's definitely like, I gotta keep a tight ship here. I gotta go towards my direction. As much as I may want to talk about this, talk about, oh my God, I had this revelation, I need to kind of keep this close to my chest, because the more that we can have that restrictiveness with our movements, kind of like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, the more we can be principled in our positions with dealing with others, making preparations for where we wish to direct our actions and our duties, and being inclined to that divinatory insight to help us get to where we're going, we can figure our way out of this. So yeah, I think this is going to be a difficult configuration. A lot of things happening, maybe not really being sure where all the pieces really fit together and where to put them. So something that we'll kind of see with time as it plays out, kind of, especially with that Piscean nature, to kind of be a little bit more ready to be where we need to be when we need to be there. And being willing to extend ourselves to really acknowledge that some of these things, we may not be able to see them, especially with this being under the rays of the sun, and both being invisible, really. So there's something about this that we have to kind of trust. We have to kind of rely on our instincts with this. We have to say, okay, and this is what we need to do. This is where we need to decisively act. And as much as it may seem like, these things are really intangible, especially with that Neptune being there, we have to take these things a little bit more serious and be a little bit more diligent in carrying them out. Not be willing to just rush to expose some of this, but be willing to kind of sit with it, to let it churn, work on us so that we can respond in a way that allows us to act for our good, act for our interest, our better interest at heart. And then right after this, Mercury will sextile Jupiter in Taurus, And Jupiter does rule the sign of Pisces, so I think that Jupiter is helping to strengthen, to support Mercury in this. Now, this aspect isn't that strong because it is a sextile, but this is connecting and tempering the serious information, potentially carrying out the waters of disillusionment to allow this to take on what it needs to take on, to carry what it needs to carry. Don't get in the way of the bigger picture and see yourself as participating in carrying the waters for the party. Stay focused and don't let up. Don't get distracted or let yourself think that nobody wants to hear what you're saying. You know, Mercury will have his time in Aries, like I said, so take time to let go and not be so involved in how others perceive and portray you. Nobody does it like you, and that is why you add the part of the soup that only tastes like you. Mix with everyone else, which may make it harder to distinguish your own voice from others. So yeah, a lot of times we can kind of be aligned with these really important figures, and maybe we're trying to disillusion some of these bonds that we're trying to break out of, maybe trying to reestablish a more secure structure for ourselves. And as much as we may feel like we aren't really playing a role in that, the day-to-day managing of ourselves, the day-to-day how we go about taking these things serious, really considering this information and not just blowing it away, but acknowledging it, trusting in it, and letting it act on us, letting us be a part of the soup, wishing to kind of blend in. I think with Mercury and Pisces, Mercury is maybe a little bit standoffish. It's a little bit like, well, I can't really communicate what I want to say as effectively as I want to, so by their standard, I'm not really actually that much of an expert, so it wouldn't really matter what I'd say or do, so I can just do whatever. And in some way, I think we forfeit the opportunity to collect the reward with others when we actually have done a lot of the work. Yeah, there's a little bit of this kind of Mercury in Virgo, I think expresses this a lot, where Mercury in Virgo is the sign of the Virgin, and so in some way we're kind of we're working more with the materials of the earth. We're being a little bit more objective, and so that objective information has nothing to say about us, right? There's no information, it's not really about us, but Pisces is kind of, a lot of it is like the sign of the collective soul, the sign of this deep meaning of where are we going, what's our direction in life, why are we here? Using that information to kind of educate the soul, to really allow the soul to be eloquent. And so with that, Mercury there's this idea of Mercury kind of accepting this duty of accepting and kind of acknowledging, okay, Jupiter is right there, kind of affirming this. So maybe this is actually good. Maybe this is something for my soul that I need to take into consideration. Yeah. So that kind of wraps up this month. That's kind of where we'll end it. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you had fun. I had a lot of fun talking about these aspects, these configurations. Yeah, I think some of my takeaways are like the Mercury-Venus one, the cool, horny. I like that. I like that keyword. Go ahead, leave a comment, like this video, tell me what you think, tell me what you're excited for, what transits you're excited for this month. Personally, I'm really excited for that Mars in Capricorn sextile, that Moon in Scorpio, as well as that Mercury in Aquarius. It's going to be an opportunity to make some talismans for that. It's on my election video. So yeah, there's some things in this month that I think are going to be really fun. Hope you enjoy that. Next month, we'll get into the eclipses. We'll get into that. We'll dip into the eclipse part of the year, where big beginnings and endings start and happen. And we'll continue on that cycle of the Libra and Aries eclipses. So, hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to get going, but you have a good day. Thank you again, and hope you take care, pigs. I'll talk to you later.